Right, I think we can get started. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be starting to do these kinds of things in person again, even if we're still masked inside in this situation. Welcome to our lecture for this evening with Kristina Wilson. I'm Randall Van Scapen. I teach art and architectural history here in the School of Architecture, Art, and Historic Preservation. I see some familiar faces and others that I don't know, so it's good to see a variety of people here. It's my special pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Kristina Wilson from not too far away. She's, as you can see, at Clark University in Worcester, where she teaches art history in the Department of Visual and Performing Arts. And she has quite a varied scholarly career in terms of her publications, including subjects on photography, on exhibitions, on interior design, and so on. So we'll get a little sense of her scope today, having seen just a few preview images as we were sitting here. Her publications include substantial studies on the early 20th century exhibition strategies of Alfred Stieglitz and his circle, as well as the Museum of Modern Art in the 20s and 30s, and interior design in the period of the Depression, which is not a typical subject in the 30s when you think about the austerity of that period. And these books both won awards from her peers. In addition to those publications, she curated or co-curated a wonderful little exhibit at the Worcester Art Museum of cyanotypes. Anybody know what a cyanotype is? Yeah. Think of blueprint drawings, like old blue drawings from architecture, you know, that sort of color, a very old process. And I had a chance to see that exhibit in 2016. It was a beautiful little exhibit that she also won an award for the exhibition design. So as an extension of her interest in American design, she recently published a book on mid-century modernist furniture that we're going to get a little peek into this evening. Published in 2021 by Princeton. Its title is Mid-Century Modernism in the American Body, and the subtitle is Race, Gender, and Politics of Power in Design. As that subtitle makes clear, her work arrives at us at a particularly opportune moment if we think about social movements in the last few years, Black Lives Matter, as well as Me Too. And scholarship is working to catch up with those sensitivities and being aware of race and gender in ways that we haven't done before. And her work is a great contribution to that. Here's the book, and she's got it in the presentation too. It's a wonderful book to even just look through. There's some amazing images, which we'll see as well. So in this book and tonight, she's going to be looking at these kind of underlying assumptions and power structures that we can decode that undergird American post-war design and advertising fields. Fields that depend on a kind of cultural value of affirmed maleness and affirmed whiteness in particular. She's going to show us some great advertisements from the post-war period that are sort of retro chic, mid-century modern furniture, which is back in style again in spades. And so it's really a visually stunning kind of period. But she unpacks how these kind of hygienic images of modernity and cleanliness and clean lines are actually reaffirming something that's sort of unstated. And she's done a lot of work in the advertising and promotional materials in that regard. For current talk, marketing, empathy, power, locating race and gender in mid-century Herman Miller designs, I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kristina Williams. Welcome to Roger Williams University.
Great. Thank you, Randall, for that very nice introduction, and thank you to Gail and to Ruben for the invitation to come here this evening. It's really exciting to do a talk like this in person, and I have to say that being here rather than in my basement bunker is just really a delight, you know, instead of giving this like over Zoom. So yes, so what I'd like to do this evening is to talk a bit about this, you know, some work that came out of this book project. And so I'm obviously showing you the cover here, and you know, this book is about the role that design objects play in interior spaces, in constructing power, and thinking about how we can reread race and gender into some designs that might actually be familiar to some of you. And so I'm hoping that what we're going to do over the course of my talk is to sort of look at maybe some designs that you know, and sort of maybe they'll begin to look a little different to you. So I'm showing you 4 images of the 4 main chapters of the book. And what I'm going to do this evening is really focus on some of the arguments that form the heart of chapter 3, which focuses on the designs of the Herman Miller Furniture Company. And I'm going to focus on 2 aspects of my research, which are suggested in some of the words that I was sort of mishmashing together in the title of my talk. So first, I want to talk about how Herman Miller's publicity, and when I say publicity, I'm thinking about articles, advertisements, PR photographs, how this publicity insinuated gendered and racialized identities into the products that they're promoting and selling. And then secondly, I want to interrogate the objects themselves more deeply. These are the actual products that were for sale, that were being promoted. And the angle that I'm going to take as we look at these objects, the specific physical things themselves, the angle I want to take is from the perspective of empathy. And that term is one I'm going to come back to and that I will describe a little bit more. And so here are some of the objects that we'll be talking about. But I wanted to actually start by just kind of laying some groundwork. And I'm offering this not to sound rudimentary, but rather these are the kinds of questions that I ask myself as a centering exercise when I'm embarking on a research project. And it's good to kind of remind yourself of like why you do this work and what are the things that are important to you. So one of the things I always have to sort of come back to is I'm a design historian. And so what does it mean to be a design historian? And what are the kinds of questions that I ask of objects like this? So the first thing that I'm often thinking about is I'm interested in how objects work, how they meet certain functional needs, how they subtly but profoundly shape our physical behavior by insisting on being used in certain ways. Secondly, many of these objects are intended or were designed first, you know, they were intended for the domestic realm. And so I'm often drawn to questions of gender because the domestic space is one where gender plays a big role. And so the kinds of questions that I ask myself are, how is the work of somebody whose job it is to maintain the house, stereotypically this might be a housewife, how is the work of the housewife, for example, affected by these designs? Are they hard to maintain or not? Another question, how do designs establish priority and unequal power relationships in different spaces of the house? Perhaps every one of you has a space in your house where there's one chair that's the best chair, and then there are other chairs that are just not quite so good. And who gets to sit in the best chair and who gets relegated to the less good chairs? These are the kinds of power relationships that objects set up in our domestic spaces. So that's the second kind of question that I ask. And then the third question that I ask of these objects is, in any history of the United States, race plays a central role. However, in general, in the field of American design history, and especially with regard to 20th century design history, race has been largely ignored. And so with this book project, as Randall was suggesting, I wanted to ask how these objects contributed to an understanding of racialized identity for their consumers in the 1940s and 50s, and how they participated in racialized constructions of power. So I want to begin by setting us up in the sort of the context of the Herman Miller Furniture Company and who are some of the key players, and they are all white men as we get started. So Herman Miller is a name that you may be familiar with, and the company has been based in Zeeland, Michigan for actually almost 100 years now. Zeeland is about an hour outside of Grand Rapids. First began selling, actually the company's been around for 100 years, but they first began selling modern furniture in 1932. So this is interesting that they've been selling modern furniture for 90 years now. And their first modern designs were by this man here, Gilbert Rohde. And through Rohde's designs, Herman Miller developed this reputation for vanguard designs. And then Rohde died suddenly, unexpectedly, in 1944. And D.J. Dupree, this man here, was the president of Herman Miller, and he was really committed in actually an almost religious way to modern furniture. And he ended up hiring this man here, George Nelson, to be the company's new design director after the death of Rohde. And who was George Nelson? So Nelson was a young architect who had built almost nothing and had designed absolutely no furniture. That's who he hired for this job. What had Rohde done to recommend himself for this job? So he had written a variety of articles about important modern architects during the 1930s, and that made him seem kind of interesting to DJ. And one of the sort of reasons that I'm introducing this sort of information about Nelson is, first of all, I think his architectural background is important. He never designed an object, a piece of furniture, as an isolated thing unto itself. He always thought of objects, design objects, as existing in an architectural space. So his concept from the beginning was always about architectural space and how objects exist in space. And secondly, he was a writer. And because of his journalistic work, writing about all of these other architects, Nelson developed an ability to analyze complex issues and explain them in lucid terms. He was actually really a fabulous writer. If you haven't read any of his writings, I recommend them to you. I quote him and deal with his writings pretty extensively in my book. He's pithy, sarcastic, humorous, and really reveals a lot in his writings. And these are just some examples of the kinds of books that he authored. And in fact, in the first chapter of my book, I spend a lot of time discussing this book here, Tomorrow's House. So George Nelson transformed the Herman Miller Furniture Company into the design powerhouse that is still a major player in the world of modern furniture today. He designed countless pieces of furniture for them. We're going to look at some of them. He studied business practices. He proposed major changes to the way they built their shipping cartons, the way they understood how to disperse and ship furniture via rail across the country. And he also got into marketing. So he designed the logo for them, which is still being used in various ways today. He came up with this logo that has like his signature on it and Charles Eames's signature on it. He also recruited a variety of major designers to come work for the company. And so Isamu Noguchi was one, and then Charles and Ray Eames, the husband and wife design partnership. So here's Noguchi and here's Eames. Nelson is the one who brought them into the company. So this is the background on the Herman Miller Company. And so now I want to get into some analysis of what's going on in the Herman Miller products from this period right after World War II, when George Nelson takes over and starts kind of transforming the company. So first, I'd like to consider how gender appears in the publicity around Herman Miller's products. My question is not so much how gender might be objectively represented in the angles or the curves of an object, but rather how these designs participated in the construction of a gendered identity from the perspective of the culture in which they were first created. So this is the booming consumer culture of post-war America, where suburban landscapes, usually segregated by race, religion, and ethnicity, sprang up somewhat cancerously across the countryside. And that's what these images, I'm just putting them up here kind of as mental placeholders for this kind of overly glossy picture of what suburbia was supposed to be like. But there's this image that it was about sort of, suburban single family homes, the birth rate skyrocketed, the nuclear family becomes the dominant icon. And so from this context, how do we understand these designs in terms of gender? So I'd like to start with George Nelson's chair designs. And here are two particularly flamboyant objects, the coconut chair and then the marshmallow sofa. And we could talk about the food afterwards. And these were really intended to stand out in a room. They are interesting from all sides, and it's really hard to put them up against a wall or a corner. And the question I originally posed to myself about these specific designs was, how might we think about these as gendered objects? I have two kinds of publicity and marketing related evidence that I want to examine. First, how does George Nelson write about these chairs and other chair designs? And then secondly, what are the photographs that accompany these writings, his writings about chairs? So Nelson famously described this tendency for chairs to stand out, literally and figuratively, in the introduction to his book that was called Chairs from 1953. And this is what he writes. He writes, when the walls disappear, and he's talking about like open floor plan, suburban houses where like there's no wall between the living room and the dining room, sometimes even between the kitchen, like it's all sort of open plan. So when the walls disappear, the only place left for furniture is out in the open. Hence, silhouette becomes important, and most traditional designs for seating become unusable. So this is a quote that I came across repeatedly when I was just getting started on this. So like, oh yeah, okay, out in the open, okay. But I finally got my hands on a copy of Chairs, and I kept reading down the page. And this is what follows. No one ever quoted the second part of what he had to say. What he goes on to say is, in this landscape, the chair remains as one of the unassimilable objects, and in consequence, it becomes very conspicuous. It becomes as much a piece of sculpture as an object of utility. One might now compare it to a girl in a bikini suit who has to pay more attention to her figure than the ladies in the bathing costumes of the Mack Sennett era. So that's interesting. He's suggesting that these chairs have to be as amazing to look at as a woman in a bikini suit or a girl in a bikini suit. And here is the opening image to the book, to the Chairs book. The very first photo is this. This is a really powerful photograph. If this is a book about chairs, what does this image say about chairs? So there are a couple of things. I mean, the woman's body becomes an abstract form. And so the curve of her shoulder echoes the shoulder of the chair, and then her waist sort of tapers in against the waist of the chair, and then there are all of these like, the longer you look at it, the more sort of doubles you see. I mean, her legs are twisted as the legs here are twisted. The pads of her feet begin to look like the pads of the feet of the chair. It makes you realize how much we anthropomorphize chairs. There's also something very uneasy, right, about how her left buttock is just like pressing halfway into the edge of the seat. And this photo is, of course, indebted to some very mainstream chauvinism, even misogyny, because, of course, her head has been entirely cut off. Yes, we're all familiar with the tired metaphor of woman as object, and now it has a new life as we consider every chair in a living room as a possible stage for a diva-like self-presentation. Every chair becomes the object of the male gaze. So what I'm proposing is that for Nelson, chairs like that coconut chair or the marshmallow sofa are gendered female. There's something to look at. I've got more evidence. So in 1957, Nelson wrote an article for Holiday magazine, which was a big glossy sort of luxury magazine. And this is another article about chairs. And it was illustrated with this striking photograph. And what's notable in this article is he talks about the visual appeal of watching a woman in a chair. And in this quote that I'm about to read to you, he's referring specifically to watching a woman in the Hardoi butterfly chair. But this is what he says. He says, quote, "A dress in this contraption usually travels upward rapidly to a point somewhere between knee and hip, which is why it is customarily photographed with a child, a large dog, or a nude." And in this same article, he admits that his own chair, which is the coconut chair right here, was not easy to sit in. This is actually what he says about it. He says, quote, "This chair needs practice and agility to sit in comfortably. We continue, however, to admire its elegance while making no mention of the fact that to enjoy the view, one naturally sits in something more comfortable," unquote. So he's basically saying his own chair is not something comfortable to sit in. You have to be agile in order to sit in it. And to enjoy the view, you sit in something else. But to enjoy what view? This is what this quote always makes me think, like, what view? The view of the chair? The view of the nude in the chair? I don't know. There's just like all sorts of sort of associations that are just kind of percolating around this language. Consider this quotation from a 1956 Herman Miller advertisement. And the ad copy in this ad here was written by Nelson. And he's describing this chaise right here. "Probably the most spectacular piece in the Herman Miller line, expensive too, is the chaise." And then we liken it to a Continental. "Properly filled, we are referring to you, madam. It is guaranteed to put a new glint into the most tired husband's eye." And what about that marshmallow sofa? Well, one of the most famous photos of it is this one. The model is Hilda Longanati, who worked in Nelson's office. And what does this photo do to the sofa and to her? So let's think about it. Like, where are we positioned? We're looking at her from behind the sofa. Thus, wherever she sits on this object, no matter where she's viewed from, her body is on display. I would argue that this image is appealing because it is all about the tantalizing glimpses we are given of her body and the expectation that our gaze desires to see more. The pleasure comes in the work of our imagination. We see her bare wrists, her bare ankles, the drape of her skirt falling away from her legs. It's like this bubble sofa has become, in the imagination of the viewer, a bubble bath. So to briefly summarize some key points about these objects, I'm not arguing that in their forms there is some essential or objective feminine line. However, they set up economies of use, vision, and power, where they are located in the room, who looks at them, and why. And it is there that I begin to see the play of gendered identity. It's also important to point out that all of these photographs, which visually fetishize chairs as women, are using white models. That in the domestic realm imagined by these publications, white women are visible, but perhaps silent. Women of color are nowhere present. They are completely invisible. This raises the question of how exactly race appears in Herman Miller's publicity materials from the period. Now, to be honest, most scholars have looked at these objects and do not see them as involved with race in any way. In this project, I spent a lot of time thinking about constructions of race in mid-century America and my own positionality as a scholar who identifies as white. One of the earliest questions I asked myself was, what if I only see these designs as quote unquote race neutral because I myself am white? What if these objects are actually invested in constructing an identity of whiteness? After all, when modernism appears in shelter magazines in these years, here's Better Homes and Gardens from 2 different years, but you also see this in American Home, House Beautiful, House and Garden. When modernism appears, the families using it always are white. If these designs are invested with establishing whiteness, how would you go about confirming this hypothesis? In my book, in the end, I do not argue that all modern design is objectively essentially white or any other race for that matter. Rather, I argue that modernism is used for different audiences and communities to differing symbolic ends. When targeting audiences who thought of themselves as white, editors and advertisers in the post-war period did deploy codes that offered modernism as a tool to shore up racial whiteness. So for example, let's look at some publicity images made for Herman Miller that feature designs by George Nelson and Charles and Ray Eames. So these here are photographs for the catalogs. Nelson's office sort of oversaw catalog production, and his office would have been responsible for photos like these 2 here. The Eames studio was responsible for all of its own photography for its products. Now, race appears in these images, my argument is, in the props that are used to accessorize the products. The props are not all identical, so it's worth itemizing a few of them. So we see, for example, woven baskets from Native American nations. We also see pottery from Native American nations in the Eames image here. Also then over here on the right in the Nelson image, there are what I believe are Oaxacan figurines down below, and then also a trio of Nayarit horn players. And then over here on the lower left is a doll who is dressed in a one-shouldered woven tapestry. So what to make of these varied objects? If we think of the props as distinct from the furniture, we begin to see a common theme of binary relationships. The props are not for sale. The furniture is for sale. The props are one of a kind, as opposed to the mechanical multiples that are the modern design. The props are nature, as opposed to industry. They are hand, as opposed to machine. They are decoration and exuberance, as opposed to austerity and restraint. They are a depicted body, as opposed to the implied body of the abstract furniture. They are sensuous, as opposed to intellectual. They are primitive, as opposed to cultured. They are finally racially colored as opposed to racially white. These juxtapositions appear throughout the catalogs and showroom interiors and also appear in Herman Miller ads. So to go back to this same ad, and this mask here is presented as a curiosity. And George Nelson is calling it a tribal mask from Java, but it's actually from Bali. Hovering here in the upper left corner, just sort of like any other object against that sort of white background. Another image that I came across early in my research that was fascinating to me is, this is literally a sketch done by this cartoonist to accompany an article about modern design. And so these are just, different examples of modern design. But in the specific example of George Nelson's case furniture, it is accessorized with this little mask that is clearly meant to represent some kind of a non-Western artifact. So to me, this suggests that even when you're going to depict just some piece of Nelson's furniture, it always gets accompanied by an object that demonstrates some kind of cultural difference that then throws it into racial whiteness. So what purpose do these props serve? I think that in the model rooms or the vignettes, the props are the repository for all non-white characteristics. And what is left for the modern design objects is a white identity. Moreover, in the particular logic of these storage devices, the mechanical, rational, racially white grid contains and systematizes all of the non-white artifacts. Everything is put in its place, carefully framed in a rectangle and subsumed within the larger master plan. It is almost as if the grid colonizes the world. And in fact, I was thinking about this was kind of like percolating through my head. And as I was going through this 1961 catalog, there is this photograph, which is very hard to capture for you all. And I don't even know that you can entirely read this here. It's like sort of the many degrees of decay of reproduction here. But the title of this book is called The Conquest of Peru. And when I saw that, it was when sort of things started, a lot of these ideas started clicking into place for me. Now, I'd like to turn to the second topic I mentioned at the outset, the question of empathy in these objects. I spent a lot of time early in this work thinking about publicity materials around the Herman Miller company. And then a colleague heard me talk about it and said to me, basically, why aren't you actually talking about the objects? Like, why aren't you really, talking about interrogating the designs themselves? Why not get up close and literally personal with the shapes, the forms, the materials of these objects? Is race implicated anywhere in them? And I decided to go back to that fundamental question that I posed for you at the beginning of my talk. As a design historian, I ask, how do objects work? How do they meet certain functional needs? How do they subtly but profoundly shape our behavior by insisting on being used in certain ways? And as I pondered this, the term that kept coming back to me is empathy, the concept of empathy. What is empathy? So between people, we talk about empathy as the ability to intuit someone's feelings so deeply that you feel with them. It's a resonance of feeling. And of course, in architecture, we talk about empathy as well. In an object, in a design object, I think that empathy operates in two ways. First, you have visual empathy. And that's the way an object presents itself to us and looks like it might be harmonious and pleasing to use. It invites the prospect of comfortable interaction. Second, you have physical empathy, and that is whether or not the object is actually physically comfortable and pleasing to use. So if you reflect on this, visual empathy, physical empathy, you're probably thinking about the fact that these two kinds of empathy do not always coincide, right? Like something may have visual empathy, it may look like it's really comfortable. And then if it's a chair, you sit down in it and you're like, whoa, this is just really not comfortable at all. Or there's an object that looks, for lack of a better word, like lousy, you know? And then you sit down and you're like, whoa, actually, this is really quite nice. So physical empathy and visual empathy do not always coincide. So what do we learn about these designs here when we interrogate them through the lenses of empathy, and how do we sort of learn about race and gender when we do that? So I want to return to the Nelson designs more and look at those more closely. So first of all, I would argue that Nelson's designs, and so here we're looking at his slat bench and some case furniture. I would argue that Nelson's designs are visually motivated by pure geometric forms, and they appear to arise directly from, there's sort of this, it's like this, just these intellectual manipulations like on a piece of drafting paper. They really seem to pay scant attention to the needs or the desires of a human user. Geometries dominate their appearance. So a viewer sees squares before she sees a cabinet, a rectangle and parallel lines before she sees a bench. And I would argue they look fairly unaccommodating to the human body. And actually about the slat bench, Nelson actually said this. He was perhaps being a little tongue-in-cheek, but this is what he said, that he said that the slat bench, the design of it was actually motivated by a desire to create an unaccommodating seat for clients. This is what he said, quote, "The reason slats were used rather than a solid plank was partly to save lumber, but mostly to create a seating surface sufficiently uncomfortable to induce visitors to leave in 20 minutes or less." Also, take a look at the drawer pulls, and we're seeing some of them in use here, but here they are. The drawer pulls for the basic cabinet series, you know, these are all very shallow and thin, and at the best, at the most, they're easily grasped by the tips of one's fingers. They force the user to be very delicate with the object rather than accommodating the full strength and torque of a hand, wrist, and arm motion. When we look at the coconut chair, do we see a chair first or do we see a triangle, the Platonic ideal of a geometric form? The coconut chair's deep reclining seat, lack of armrests, and 3 legs present a challenge for the potential sitter. One must rely on one's own sense of balance, right, to sit down into the seat, because what's missing, right? There are no arms to this chair. So like you have to like, you know, it's like you have to be very good with your yoga, you know, to sort of like get yourself sort of angled back into it. As I've already quoted to you, Nelson said, quote, "This chair needs practice and agility to sit in comfortably." Now, a colleague of mine pointed out once that, because I was saying, oh, and then the 3 legs, they're so unstable. And so this colleague of mine was like, well, you know, actually the tripod was the standard for establishing a level field for scientific instruments in the 1950s. It was like this sort of cutting edge, you know, scientific way of sort of constructing scientific instruments. So that a tripod is actually not unstable. It was the very definition of stable. So I thought, whoa, okay, maybe you have destabilized my entire argument. But on the other hand, if Nelson is using the tripod as a scientific model, doesn't that mean that he's basically equating the human body with a scientific specimen to be measured? I don't know. I think, again, it suggests that for Nelson, these chairs are not about people, they're about ideas. And it's perhaps revealing that among the early publicity images for the chair was a series of photographs with no human beings, but instead Nelson's dog sitting in the chair. And finally, the marshmallow sofa poses additional challenges to the human user. And maybe you've experienced this when you sit on it. The individual cushions are each 10 inches in diameter. So these are too small to accommodate adult hips and backsides, leaving sitters to uncomfortably straddle two discs. Moreover, if one sits too far to one corner, this is actually an insight that was shared with me by the archivist at Herman Miller. If you sit on the corner of this and nobody's counterbalancing you, the whole thing flips over. So, because the skeletal steel frame isn't really heavy enough. Now, as visually empathetic forms, the designs manufactured by Herman Miller that came out of the office of Charles and Ray Eames are substantively different from the Nelson designs. The plywood chairs are less rigidly geometric. They have sinuous contours that appear to be biomorphic because they recall the human figure. In the lounge chair with metal legs, one imagines, well, in all three of these really, one imagines that the sheets of plywood were wet, a person sat down on them, leaned back, and the plywood gently melded to her body. When we look at this chair, we see not just a landscape of curves, but perhaps even more vividly, the ghost of the person who occupied it before us. The plastic chair has a similar fluidity, apparently molded around a seated figure. These designs call forth a body through negative space, and they are arresting in their blatant sensuousness, in their visual evocation of a body that touches them and is touched by them. So what is the meaning of the difference between the Eames designs, which visually welcome the body, and the Nelson designs, which seem to deny a body? The Eames designs might be read through their visual form as inviting the specificity of an individual body and can be described as possessing visual empathy. Nelson's designs, in contrast, deny the individual body. They speak to a universal concept of the body that opens drawers, a body that sits down to rest. And I argue that their generality reveals a philosophical place of privilege. It's not just that Nelson's designs are fundamentally alienating or bodily uncomfortable. In their lack of visual empathy, they presume a level of authority over the lives of those who use them. They do not have to cater to the body because the place of white privilege assumes that it knows all bodies. Ultimately, the geometric forms and lack of visual empathy in Nelson's designs can be read as a sign of their assumed supremacy, of their racial whiteness. But what about that other kind of empathy that I was talking about? Physical empathy. A physically empathetic object creates a satisfying bodily interaction. As the Eames designs visually and imaginatively evoke a specific body, are they actually comfortable? Or is it possible that in fact they physically limit the user's body by prescribing an ideal body? And here I began to think about the origins of Charles and Ray Eames chair designs. And maybe this is a history that some of you are familiar with. Their initial designs with their initial experiments with compound curves and bent plywood were conducted during World War II, when they built this crazy machine called the Kazam machine in their living room for bending plywood, and they developed leg splints that were used in the battlefield for medical evacuations. So a leg splint is a prescriptive form. It offers a template of ideal health against which the injured body is anchored, and it provides the guideline for able-bodied recovery. Using the same technology, the post-war Eames chairs provide a template for an ideal body. They make visible the healthy body through our imagined reading of the ghost of the chair's previous sitter reclining against the compound curves. And they make invisible any disabled body, such as the disabled body of the veteran. As the splint controls the wounded leg, the curves in these chairs physically discipline the bodies that sit in them. Now, the Eames designed body may not have gender or race identifiably imprinted upon it, but I would argue that an ideal size is. There are bodies that are demonstrably too small or too large to be comfortable in these allegedly inviting designs. Hips that slide around, unmoored against the relentless continuous curves, or thighs that spill out, pushing against the inflexible edges of the arced contours. Moreover, the angles of the chairs prescribe certain postures, and with their specific curves, they disallow alternative uses, or at least comfortable alternative uses. And evidence of the discipline that these chairs might exert over their users appears in this Motorola television advertisement that appeared in Ebony magazine. And so here's the full ad. And then here are the two details from the photograph at the top of the ad that I've enlarged. And I do spend a lot of time talking about this ad in my book. And as you can see, what struck me about this ad at the outset is that there are two Eames chairs that populate the living room of this ad, and they are fairly unforgiving to the Black children at this birthday party. Two children uncomfortably squeeze onto the chair on the left, each with a leg falling off the side, and the girl apparently holding onto the edge of the chair to kind of keep her balance. And then the girl in the chair on the right, she's leaning far forward, her head over her lap as she strains towards the television, as if she's trying to resist the chair's insistence that she recline. The prescriptive form of the ghost-like body in the Eames chair is not simply a specific size, but it also holds a particular unmoving pose. It insists on stillness, which these children gamely try to resist. And in fact, I think this may, as a sort of side point here, I think this feature may explain why so many generations of elementary school classroom furniture are sort of knockoffs of the Eames designs, because they prescribe this kind of still sitting position. Indeed, for all of its lack of visual empathy, Nelson's marshmallow sofa is more available for alternative uses and movement by the sitter's body than any of the Eames chairs. So there's the photo that I talked about earlier, but that's just one example of a model sitting on the sofa in an unorthodox pose. When I was in the Nelson archive, I also found ones like this here in the lower right. What's to make of these? At the very least, they suggest that Nelson wanted to promote the sofa's flexibility, even if he didn't think he could convince people that it was actually comfortable. It's a sofa that inspires movement rather than enforces stillness, to counter its lack of visual and physical empathy. So to go back to comparing these, the Eames designs might have greater visual empathy than the Nelson designs. They certainly look more comfortable, but ultimately their physical empathy is lacking. They don't provide comfort, but rather enact authority over the body of the user. What I'm saying here is this: the strategies of the Nelson designs and the Eames designs may differ, but they both result in the same thing, a message of control over the body that uses them. Nelson disregards the individual in the pursuit of Platonic geometric purity, and assumes that the bodies of all users will submit to his abstract reasoning and won't mind that the objects are uncomfortable to use, while Eames offers specificity and thus locks the user into a prescribed bodily form. Furthermore, in the specific historical period of the 1940s and 50s in the US, which was characterized by persistent racial segregation and prohibitions on the movements and actions of Black people, the authority exercised by these designs can be understood as an expression of racial whiteness, a way of defining and maintaining racial privilege. The racial identity of the designers, all of whom were white, is undoubtedly important here, but my analysis is not intended to ascribe conscious racializing agendas to the designers. Rather, we should recognize that these objects strategically control bodies, both women's bodies and bodies of color, and legislate physical behaviors through their visual and physical forms. We should contextualize this control within the larger historic moment of their creation. In an era when white bodies could control bodies of color and did so in order to define superiority and establish racial identity, and in an era of retrenched patriarchy, to design objects that discipline bodies into specific comportment is an act of white patriarchal privilege. So my goal with this project is to unsettle how these designs have been read and indeed fetishized in the current fad for all things mid-century modern. It is not, however, to categorically dismiss modern design. Rather, it's to open up a more critical reading of the past, which can allow for a more open-ended approach to modernism in our current time. And now I would enjoy taking some questions. So thank you. If you have any. Yeah.
I know you talk about this a little bit in your book about Black modernism.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Johnson publication headquarters in Chicago in particular had this amazing style interiors.
Yep.
And I wonder if you see that as a response to this sort of modernism, or like how do you understand that or interpret it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a couple of things. So the interiors of the Johnson Publishing Company that are best documented and are best known are actually from a renovation in the 60s and early 70s. So like the current ebony test kitchen that there's an exhibit about is a test kitchen from, I believe, the early 70s, which is all terrific, really interesting modern design, but just a little bit later than the period that I was focusing on for my book. What's fascinating though is that there is in 1955, which was the 10th anniversary of ebony, there is an extensive article that does walk through the different spaces of the ebony offices, which are a bit different than the ones that everybody knows. So there are some places that are modern, like John H. Johnson's office, and there are some places that are a little bit more period interior decoration, like the opening sort of foyer space. So that's one thing that is that's interesting and that's interesting and sort of, I think, maybe important to understand in a sort of contextually specific way. The chapter that I devoted to talking about modernism, modern design in ebony in the 1950s, in that chapter, what the sort of departure point for that chapter and that question was, I had done all of this thinking about things like the Herman Miller stuff, and I was thinking, like, so if people who are not white are buying this furniture, are they buying it to be white? What are is whiteness the only way of seeing and understanding modernism in this period? It's certainly there, I think, in this stuff, but is that the only discourse of modernism? And what I found when I started looking at ebony is, first of all, there's relatively little Herman Miller, which is interesting, but also that the modern furniture that appears in ebony is being used very differently than it appears in interior decorating magazines with white audiences, or in Life magazine, which has a predominantly white audience. And that modernism in ebony is really being used as a tool to enable a very sort of sociable, gregarious, confident lifestyle that is really grounded in this expression of bodily comfort, rather than control or exclusion or defensiveness, which seems to be a lot of what is what are these underlying forces that are guiding the campaigns of people like the Herman, or places like the Herman Miller Company. So that's why I inserted that caveat to say that one of the key arguments to my book is to say that modernism doesn't mean just one thing. It's rather that there are multiple histories of modernism. So I guess the goal of this project is to say, first of all, the history that gets told most frequently is actually a white history, and we need to see that. And second of all, that there are multiple other histories. And it's important to not replace one with the other, but to actually hold them in stereo. Because when we start evaluating and seeing what gets emphasized in other histories, then we can start appreciating what is unstated and unsaid in the white history. Although what I've just given you here is a lot of exhuming what is unstated and unsaid in this white history. So sorry, that was kind of a long rambling answer. Yeah, Gail.
I'm so interested in Paul Williams, as you know.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if what you just said about Ebony magazine and this idea of comfort, if that comes through in his house design, especially the ones that you presented in the handbooks of house design.
Right. So yeah, so so in the first chapter of the book, I am comparing 5 different decorating advice manuals. And so 2 of them are by Paul Williams, who was the most important African-American architect, the first admitted to the AIA, and had this, stellar career, architect to the stars, for those of you who don't know him, based in Southern California. And so he wrote 2 books, and then I can put it into dialogue with several other books that are all about sort of home design, decorating advice, this kind of thing. And his there's not as much discussion of comfort, but there are some ways that his book is in alignment with Nelson and some of the sort of, there's a certain kind of architect's approach to things that is similar. So there are some ways that he's in alignment with some of his white colleagues, and that there are other ways where his approach, I think, is meaningfully different. One of the things that I was thinking about, because I chose all of these books because they all had an investment in modernism, and I was thinking about what value they put in modernism. And the white authors tend to all, again, draw distinctions. George Nelson is like, you're with us or are you're against us? I mean, he literally says in the opening chapter of the book, this book is all about modernism. And if you don't like modernism, then you should just close the book, return it to your bookstore, and just don't read any further. I mean, he's adamant about it. But the language of everybody else is, for those who like modernism, modernism is this elite thing. Whereas Williams's rhetoric is very much more about bringing people together and not about divisiveness. So he talks about modernism as the style that everybody's interested in. So he's like, on the one hand, he's sort of bringing everybody together, but he also is very adamant or very clear to say, there are lots of styles that lots of people like, and modernism is just one of them, and there are many other styles. And so he's actually quite Catholic in his, he's very open-minded in his embrace of multiple different styles. And so I think that's an interesting, that's an interesting rhetorical difference, that he's very much about reaching across differences. You can sort of sense him wanting to bring his readership together, rather than cultivating.
And I was thinking that as an architect, he's going to get clients, given his status as, a Black or African American architect. He needs to be able to be comfortable with all of these clients, talk to everybody. And I'm not remembering my source for this, but somewhere I read that this is not the kind of thing that lands you on the cover of Architectural Forum in 1950. You have to be the adamant, avant-garde, and
Right.
very, kind of committed to this progressive vision.
Right,
And
right.
This is, the kind of plight of an African American architect who is building a clientele. And we have to say the same for Julia Morgan, that you really need to present yourself to your clients as somebody who's not going to challenge them. Otherwise, you're not going to, you're not going to get the clients. I mean, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean,
You have to establish a kind of even playing the field and relate to them very well. And from what I understand of Williams, is he's just very charismatic.
very charismatic.
That's the kind of architect you are.
Well, and he presents himself as someone who's always walking alongside his clients, but perhaps also like a step or two ahead, sort of saying, oh, but you could, you should outfit it, you should furnish it this way. I mean, like he's always kind of envisioning for his clients, a couple of steps ahead of where they are. But you're definitely right that he's not drawing distinctions, and he's not sort of pitching battles the way with the stridency that would necessarily need to have somebody, which would get you landing on the cover of something like Architectural Forum. But his approach. So what I think is interesting is his approach of bringing people together, modernism as one style, as a style that might perhaps bring people together, and also as a style that enables living, as opposed to a style that excludes or divides. And it's that language of enabling and being possibly a tool of living that I think is a slightly different value system than you hear among white designers. And it's not that white designers don't think modernism is a tool. It's just not a tool of living. It's just not it's not the first frame of reference. Their first frame of reference is this is a way to distinguish yourself. So it's again, what you see is value systems being exposed. Yeah.
I really appreciate you're getting my brain going in so many different directions, and you're talking about different stories of modernism. If I could throw a couple of things out that hopefully it kind of comes from some of the things you raised. I'm not old enough to have been around when he did these things, and some others, but going to architecture school in the late 70s and 80s in the Midwest, there was a lot of stuff like this around, and it always felt like this was the standard.
Mm-hmm.
And how uncomfortable it all felt to my friends and I in school. And we wondered, and we grew up as little kids, even though I was white, floating around in these chairs, sliding around and not being able to, all the way through those interesting years in open school systems with all this kind of furniture that was floating around. And we all thought, we were told it was supposed to be this new inclusive vision, but it didn't fit. And it had an emptiness often, even though some of Nelson's stuff and Eames's is really wonderful. But in comparison, later on, but at the same time, Le Corbusier, the famous French architect, his drawings didn't have idealized women or men. They were idealized in a way, but if you look at the drawings of actual schemes, everybody's a little lopsided or a little unique. There's stuff to eat. People are playing baseball or hoeing something in a garden. It is not an image of life. It is trying to be life. In some way too. Another person that I think I just keep thinking of this is a landscape architect, Garrett Ekbo. Did a lot of landscapes for a lot of buildings that are like some of these. Probably did some for Paul Williams, and he always had his family in the pictures.
Oh, that's interesting.
And maybe he thought he was being the ideal family, but I think it was more that it was a counter to the idealization and the
Sterility.
idealization of
Yeah.
everything, which
Yeah.
he stridently wrote against in his writings,
Uh-huh.
and talked about one world, which
Uh-huh.
included addressing and writing in the 50s, 40s through the late 70s, that we needed to have an open, inclusive society. And so and not trying to run off sideways to your thing, I think your presentation just drives that all home to me, because I do think that, I don't think that George Nelson maybe was trying to drill us and make us, but we bought it, or it became the society standard. And again, as a Midwestern college student,
Mhm.
man, it was like, what are we going to do to make the world more human? Except we thought it was all cool stuff, and it was everywhere.
Yeah.
Miller and Steelcase was all over
Yes.
the place.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
but it wasn't as much on the West Coast,
Yeah.
where there was a more living landscape idea and dwelling idea, and there
Right.
was a lot more scanning.
Right.
It was and just one last thing.
Yeah.
Is to your point about the world that this was part of. I'm sure you know it. Students may not know it yet, but literally, subdivisions were not allowed to have mixed race
Right.
presence.
Right.
They had to be all white, or the federal government would not
Would not insure.
finance.
Yeah.
So you couldn't have a mortgage.
Right.
Well, who can afford to have a new house without a mortgage? I mean, it was the law
Yes.
across the entire country. And so this kind of homogeneity of sorts, and the what it does to our visions of each other,
Mm-hmm.
control it exerts, like you say,
Mm-hmm.
it's just it's so true, it seems to me.
Yeah.
I so appreciate you doing that, and it made me think of some of these other things that I've been watching on, but it's really powerful what you've done. I really appreciate it.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you. I feel like for me, one of the starting places for this project was just like these pictures of sort of idealized suburbia, and just thinking like the story in American design history is that the post-war period is like the triumph of modernism. Modern design finally achieved mass acceptance, and it achieved affordability. It sort of, we got into an industrial level of production, so things could be affordable, and everybody loved it, and that's history. That's sort of like, that was the moment of triumph. And what I wanted to push back against and to interrogate was this glossy ideological story, because you look at these pictures of the suburbs and you think there are so many problems with this. Black people are not allowed to buy homes. People of a variety of different, of all races except white, are not allowed to buy homes in a lot of these places. The white women who were living there were often desperately unhappy and left alone, and all day long, while their husbands went off to jobs that were also not like. So that this happy, for whom was it happy? I do not know, but so it was wanting to interrogate that, and to also say that if we write a history that the other part of this, and maybe this is work that will be ongoing for me a little bit, is to say that when you write a history that prioritizes affordability, then you're prioritizing the designers who had access to industrial contacts. And in the 50s, that was largely white men. And so you're not, if that is your value system, as opposed to, say, comfort or legacies of craft skill or something, if your value system is affordability, then you are excluding a lot of other designers who are working in this time period, making interesting objects for clients, but they don't become a part of the story of what design in the middle decades of the 20th century was. So thanks for your comment. Yeah, Gail.
I guess just to follow up a little on Steve, reading your book made me think a little bit differently about urban renewal. I mean, we all know what happened with urban renewal, but I've just been writing a little piece on the Prudential Center, and informed by Ellie Rubin's book. But I've been looking at very much how this was created across other places like it in New York and elsewhere, the World Trade Center ultimately, but where you're seeing appreciably these vast plazas and, you know, skyscrapers that, you know, the financing of these things supports this space. And of course, you have people like Gropius saying, look, we need this public space in cities because they're overcrowded, the automobiles are coming in, they're congested and so on. No mention really I've seen a place, but then when you think about it, you know full well that these are little islands, because you see Prudential Center, they talk about they have a circumambient road that runs around the whole day.
Yes,
And
yes, yes,
plazas,
yes.
you know, ostensibly so people have public space, right? But, you know, when you look at what's going on in the cities right now, we've got a lot of ethnic diversity. We've got the highways coming in, eviscerating communities.
Yes,
All
yes,
this little white island.
yes, yes, yeah,
People can work and go shopping and.
right, right, right.
And they're saying we've got to, you know, bring people in from the suburbs, you know, so you bring them, you know, from the towns and, you know.
Yeah.
The suburbs, bring them in at these highways and then here they are, they park, you know, fast parking areas and they're on their white island, they're on their white island. And
Yeah.
so to me, this is kind of the counterpoint of now, you helped me kind of think a little bit more deeply about urban renewal, which again, many of us know the kind of common whatever thought on it these days, but
Yeah,
somehow I'm seeing it in a different light.
yeah,
Of what you said.
yeah, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Are there any other questions? Thank you all for staying with us for the whole time. Thanks for coming.